The billionaire's card was declined. Then a little girl did the impossible. The supermarket was alive with everyday noise, carts rattling, scanners beeping, and voices blending into a careless rhythm. No one noticed at first when a man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped forward at the checkout line. His face was familiar, the kind that had been printed on magazines, tied to skyscrapers and billion-dollar headlines. The air around him carried power, and people whispered as they recognized the billionaire in their midst. Yet in seconds that aura would collapse. The cashier slid his platinum card, and the screen answered with a single word that cut sharper than any insult: declined. If you believe that even the richest can face moments of humiliation, and that kindness from the least expected place can change everything, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you saw a billionaire's card declined in public? The pause was heavier than silence. The cashier, cheeks flushing, tried again. The same word appeared, unyielding. The man's lips tightened, his mask of confidence refusing to crack, but inside, a storm was breaking. He had silenced rivals, commanded boardrooms, and built empires. Yet here, in front of strangers, a machine had stripped him of control. Another attempt. Declined. Again. Declined. The beeps felt like hammers, each strike louder than the last. Whispers stirred among those waiting in line. Some leaned in, curious, their eyes gleaming with disbelief. Others raised their phones, the quiet click of cameras turning into proof that even giants could fall. He reached for another card, sliding it with urgency. Declined. Another. Declined. His movements, once steady, betrayed a frantic edge. The pile of plastic in his hand felt suddenly cheap, a useless collection of promises broken by a single word. And then laughter. At first small, hidden behind palms. Then bolder, sharper, cutting through the air. The billionaire's broke, someone muttered, just loud enough to slice into his pride. Heat crawled up his neck, shame spreading faster than he could contain. He had bought everything wealth could buy: respect, fear, admiration. But none of it shielded him from ridicule. Parents shook their heads, children pointed, strangers mocked. Phones recorded his stillness, capturing the exact second power dissolved into humiliation. Tomorrow his face would circle the world online, not as a symbol of strength but of failure. He was no longer untouchable. He was a man, stripped bare, reduced to the sound of a card that would not pass. The cashier's hands trembled as she whispered an apology, but the damage was done. The aisle had become a stage, and every eye a merciless spotlight. His empire, built over decades, could not protect him from the cruelty of this moment. And yet, as the humiliation grew unbearable, salvation was already waiting where no one expected. Not in another card, another account, or another desperate phone call. It would come from a child standing only a few feet away, small, unnoticed, holding almost nothing but the courage to do what no one else dared. A hand that owned no wealth, but carried the one treasure the billionaire had lost: the power of pure generosity. The sound of laughter spread through the supermarket like wildfire. What had begun as muffled chuckles now echoed in open amusement, the humiliation of one man turning into entertainment for dozens. Faces lit by phone screens leaned closer, eager to capture the image of the untouchable billionaire reduced to nothing. Every angle was recorded, every whisper magnified by the cruelty of curiosity. His name, once associated with power and prestige, would now circle the internet as a spectacle. He stood rigid, trying to hold on to dignity that was slipping through his fingers like sand. The machine beeped again, rejecting yet another card. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something in his ear. The boy's laugh rang sharp, pure, unfiltered. It pierced deeper than the jeers of adults. Shame is heavier when it comes from innocence because it reveals truth without malice. The cashier's hands trembled as she apologized in a low voice, but her words did nothing to soften the blow. She too avoided his eyes, as if looking at him might bring the same misfortune upon her. He had paid for silence in boardrooms, for obedience in politics, for loyalty in his empire, but here, surrounded by strangers, there was nothing left to buy. His wealth meant less than the coins jangling in the pocket of the boy laughing at him. For years, he had been the man who defined value, who decided what was worth building and what could be discarded. But now it was his worth being measured by the harshest of scales: public opinion. And in this moment he was worth only ridicule. He could almost hear the headlines forming: the billionaire who couldn't pay for groceries. His rivals would savor it, his partners would question it, and his empire would shake from the tremors of a single scene captured on countless phones. The noise around him swelled into a roar of whispers and laughter, until the supermarket no longer felt like a place of purchase but an arena of spectacle. He had been powerful, admired, feared, but now he was nothing more than a man trapped beneath the gaze of strangers. He wanted to scream that it was a mistake, that his accounts overflowed, that this was not who he was. But pride held his tongue, and shame strangled the words before they could form. He thought of his life outside these walls. His penthouse high above the city, his office carved into the skyline, his name inscribed on contracts worth more than the entire store. But those things could not protect him here. Reputation could not stop a machine from flashing the same relentless word. Wealth could not silence the laughter now circling him like vultures. Power, he realized, is fragile when built only on perception. He stared at the pile of cards in his hand, each one a symbol of privilege and excess, now reduced to useless plastic. They were meant to open every door, solve every problem, buy every solution. Yet here, in the simplest transaction, they had failed him. The weight of humiliation pressed harder, threatening to crush what remained of his composure. Some in the crowd smirked with satisfaction, as if his downfall justified their struggles. Others shook their heads, pity flashing in their eyes before quickly turning away. Pity was worse than mockery. Pity meant he had lost not only respect but also fear, the currency that had guarded his place in the world. For the first time in decades he felt small. Smaller than the cashier apologizing with downcast eyes. Smaller than the teenagers filming him with cruel delight. Smaller even than the child who laughed without understanding the depth of the wound he had opened. A billionaire, stripped of titles and empires, reduced to the raw fragility of being human. And then came the stillness. For a moment, the noise dulled, the laughter faded into the background, and he was left alone with his humiliation. The world had shifted beneath his feet and there was no going back. He could rebuild fortunes, regain influence by new towers of glass, but he would never forget this moment. This scar would remain, etched deeper than any failure in business, because it was not money he lost but dignity. The weight of it nearly broke him. His knees ached with the urge to collapse, his chest burned with shame, his mind scrambled for escape. But no exit presented itself. He was trapped in the spectacle of his own downfall, helpless to stop it. What he did not know, what none of the onlookers could imagine, was that the story was not finished. Humiliation was only the beginning. From the edge of the crowd, a pair of small eyes watched differently, not with ridicule, not with pity, but with something else entirely. A courage too pure for calculation, a kindness too rare for this world. And soon, the weight crushing him would be lifted not by fortune, not by pride, but by the fragile hand of a little girl who had almost nothing, yet was about to do the impossible. The silence after humiliation is heavier than laughter. The billionaire stood frozen, a man built on power and image, now left hollow by the rejection of a machine and the scorn of strangers. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his hand still gripping the useless stack of cards as if clinging to the last fragments of pride. Around him, the audience of ordinary people had turned into judges, each glare and smirk another sentence against him. For them his fall was a spectacle. For him, it was the collapse of a world he had thought indestructible. And then, through the blur of faces, something unexpected stirred. It was not another laugh, nor a phone raised for recording. It was movement from below, from a height that most ignored. A child pushed gently through the crowd, her steps hesitant but determined. She could not have been more than 9 years old. Her clothes were worn, shoes scuffed, hair tangled from neglect, yet her eyes, large, brown, unyieldingly alive, held a light that pierced through the bitterness of the scene. In her small hands she carried a crumpled bill and a few coins, the kind of money that in the hands of adults meant nothing, but for her was everything. It was her treasure, perhaps saved over weeks, perhaps meant for food or a toy she might never own. And yet, in this moment, she walked toward the man everyone else mocked, holding out the little she had as if it could erase the weight of his shame. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some sneered. Others chuckled with disbelief. A girl with almost nothing daring to help a man who owned everything. It seemed absurd, almost comical. "Look at that," someone whispered, the billionaire being saved by a child. The irony was too sharp for some to resist. Yet beneath the mockery, another truth glimmered. What she was doing took courage that none of them possessed. The billionaire's eyes fell on her, and for the first time since the word decline flashed on the screen, his mask broke. His gaze softened, confusion blending with something he hadn't felt in years, humility. He looked at the child, at the offering in her trembling hands, and felt the collapse inside him shift into something else. The shame was still there, burning like fire, but now another force pressed against it, the undeniable weight of innocence. The cashier stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh, to cry, or to accept the child's gesture. Phones captured the moment, lenses trained on the tiny figure who dared to stand where adults would never. The girl placed the crumpled notes on the counter, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the seriousness of her decision. She believed with all her heart that she was helping. For her, it was simple: she saw someone in need and she gave what she had. She did not measure worth in billions or balance sheets. She knew only the hunger of an empty stomach, the cold of a night without blankets, and the rare miracle when a stranger offered kindness. She recognized the look of need because she had lived it herself. The billionaire could barely breathe. All his life he had been surrounded by people who bowed to him, who offered favors in exchange for profit, who calculated every gesture for gain. No one had ever stood before him offering something that cost them everything, expecting nothing in return. This was not charity. It was sacrifice. It was purity. Laughter still bubbled among some in the crowd, but it sounded hollow now. Others lowered their phones, their expressions shifting from mockery to awe. What they were witnessing was not just humiliation anymore. It was transformation, and it had been sparked by the courage of a child with nothing more than a few crumpled bills and a heart unwilling to ignore suffering, even the suffering of a man who once seemed untouchable. The billionaire did not take the money. He could not. His pride, though shattered, still resisted. But more than that, he realized the act itself was worth infinitely more than the value in her hand. The gesture was not about paying for groceries. It was about restoring dignity. In her eyes, he was no longer a billionaire, no longer a fallen giant. He was simply a person in need, and that was enough for her to act. Something broke inside him, not like glass shattering but like chains loosening. He felt tears threaten to rise, but he swallowed them down, unwilling to expose that vulnerability to the sea of strangers still watching. Yet inside, he knew this moment would mark him forever. His life, measured in wealth and empire, had been overturned not by markets or rivals, but by the compassion of a little girl who owned almost nothing. The cashier finally pushed the bills gently back toward the child, her eyes wet. The crowd fell into an uneasy quiet, the weight of what they had witnessed settling into their bones. The billionaire turned, his gaze locked on the girl, and though no words passed between them, an unspoken promise hung in the air. He would not forget her. He could not. The girl returned to her mother's side, clutching her doll, unaware that she had just altered the course of another person's destiny. For her, it was nothing extraordinary. For him, it was the impossible. And as he walked out of the supermarket, his head still bowed under the remnants of humiliation, he carried with him not the sting of laughter, but the light of a gesture that demanded to be repaid, not with money but with change. The girl did not think of herself as brave. She thought in smaller measures, in bites that lasted longer, in minutes of warmth stolen from a patch of sun on a winter wall, in coins that felt heavy because they were hard to find. The supermarket faded behind her like a noisy dream, but the feeling stayed, the steady certainty that helping mattered even when help was small. She slipped her hand into her mother's, the crumpled bills returned but not wasted. What she carried home was not money, it was the quiet heat that rises in the chest when you do the thing your heart insists is right. Her world had always been built from fragments. There was the room they sometimes rented by the week, a space with paint that peeled in long curls and a window that stuck if you breathed on it wrong. There were corridors that smelled of bleach and onion and tired people. There were stairwells where echoes swallowed voices, laundromats where warmth was bought by the cycle, and churches where kindness unlocked doors on cold nights. There were mornings when the city felt generous and others when it tightened like a fist. She learned the city's private map early, the bakery that left day-old bread near the back, the grocer who looked away when a bruised apple went missing, the cafe that rinsed out a paper cup and poured hot water without asking why. She learned the faces that meant safety and the faces that meant run. She learned to make her body smaller in crowds and larger when someone tried to cut in front of her mother at a charity line. She learned how to count with her fingers under the table so the numbers stayed hers until it was time to hand them over. The doll had come from a woman whose name she never learned. It appeared on a gray Sunday, placed into her arms with a sentence that smelled of soap and tired hope, "For your little princess." The doll's painted eye was chipped, the dress too bright for its fraying hem, the small plastic hand forever lifted in greeting. The girl named nothing aloud, not even the doll. Names made things easier to lose, but inside she called it guardian. When the room was too loud, the doll listened. When the room was too quiet, the doll watched. Sometimes the girl pressed her cheek to its hard plastic face and pretended it warmed like skin. Hunger taught lessons no school tried to teach. It taught her how to distract a stomach with stories. In the longest hours she imagined kitchens where pots spoke in steam and cupboards sang. She invented a palace where chairs never wobbled and each plate balanced like a full moon in patient hands. In those stories, the doll was royal not because a crown was inked on its forehead but because it could sit at the head of any table without being told to move. When the story finished, the room stayed the room, but the ache inside it dulled enough to wait out another hour. Her mother moved through days with the careful energy of someone rationing breath. There were shifts that ended before they began, supervisors that liked promises more than pay, mornings that started with hope and ended with arithmetic. The girl watched her mother's hands, how they found work in anything: mending, scrubbing, sorting, smoothing the edge of fear from a child's hair. She also watched the moments when those hands fell still, as if remembering that kindness does not refill a wallet. In those pauses, the girl would pass her a cup of tea with too much sugar and say nothing. It was their treaty with the day. School happened in pieces: a borrowed classroom here, a volunteer program there, a library hour when the shelter's list had space for them. She knew letters the way she knew faces, some always kind, some less so. Books were a country she could visit without papers. In those pages, lives turned on sentences, villains learned, heroes failed, losses were answered with long walks and late apologies. She liked most the stories where a small character, overlooked by everyone, opened a door no one else could see. The coins she carried to the supermarket that day had taken weeks to gather. A sweep beneath the laundromat benches, a reward from a neighbor for an extra bag carried up 4 flights, a tip from a woman who liked the way the girl lined shoes by the door when she cleaned the hallway for free. The money was meant for something small and delicious, a treat she could split with her mother on a bench and pretend, for the length of a cookie, that the city's weather was gentle. When the machine flashed its word and the laughter rose, the plan rearranged itself without consulting her. A different hunger took its place, the kind that hurts when you watch someone bleed from pride. The girl understood humiliation as a kind of cold. She had seen it wrap around her mother when a manager dismissed them with a gesture meant for flies, when a clerk pretended not to hear a question, when a stranger tossed advice at them like crumbs. Work harder, try smiling, be grateful. She recognized the billionaire's posture not because she had worn it, but because she had witnessed its ruin on faces that had far less to cushion the fall. She knew what it cost to keep your back straight when the room bent your name into something small. After the supermarket, she and her mother walked the long way home to avoid the bus fare. The city had a different color on foot. They passed a construction site where cranes craned without moving, a fountain that pretended to be a river, a bronze statue of a man holding paper turned to stone. The girl imagined the statue stepping down to carry groceries for someone else. It made her laugh, a small sound that surprised even her. That night the room felt farther from the street than usual. They had rice and a little chicken, which is a feast when measured by the week. The girl placed the doll on the table as a guest, a private joke that made her mother's mouth soften into a line that wanted to be a smile. They ate slowly, each bite checked against tomorrow. The girl told the story without telling it, how sometimes a mountain can slip on a pebble and learn the ground again. Her mother listened with the careful attention of someone inventorying grace. When the girl closed her eyes, the day widened into memory. She saw the cold benches where they had slept when the shelter was full. She saw the chalk drawings she made on sidewalks to make the ground friendlier to feet. She saw the way fear looks different in daylight and in dark. She saw the cashiers who treated her mother as if kindness were a borrowed coat, and the one who had once tucked an orange into their bag without naming it charity. She saw the afternoon she discovered a library's back entrance and the world beyond it, and how words could build a staircase wide enough for both of them. Underneath those pictures ran a thread she could not cut. It said, "You are small, but small is enough when you use it." It said, "You cannot fix the hole, but you can repair an edge." It said, "If the world is a net, be one knot that holds." She did not know the word philosophy, but she lived one anyway. Across the city, a man stared into a night that would not comfort him. He replayed the sound laughter makes when it forgets its manners. He lifted a glass and did not drink. He looked at the stack of cards on his desk as if they might apologize. He had learned many numbers, yet none could measure what the girl had given by offering what she could not afford to lose. Somewhere between his windows and the darkness outside, a decision began to gather shape. Morning returned with its blunt mercy. The girl woke to the smell of street and steam and the familiar knock of rent against the door of possibility. She folded the comforter as if making neatness could pay a bill. She tucked the doll into the bag that also held a pencil, 2 rubber bands, a bar of soap wrapped in paper, and a wish she never voiced aloud. Her mother tied her hair back with a ribbon that used to be red. They stepped into a day that looked like others, but carried a slight tilt, as if one small act had set the city on a gentler angle. The girl felt it in the way shoes seemed to soften their scoldings, in how the wind paused before biting. She did not know she was being searched for. She did not know that somewhere a driver waited in a car that moved only when told to move, that a man who had been made small in public was now willing to learn the size of responsibility in private. When she reached the corner where the bus kiosk threw a shadow wide enough to be useful, a car slowed with deliberate care. It stopped not close enough to startle, not far enough to miss. The door did not open. The window did not lower. A presence simply waited, as if asking a question that would take more than words to answer. The girl touched the doll's stiff hand and looked at her mother, who looked back with the expression of someone who has learned to test miracles like ice. The day held its breath. Somewhere inside the car, a choice refined itself into action, and the path between strangers began to shorten. The car idled with quiet patience, its polished frame out of place against the cracked pavement of the neighborhood. The girl clutched her doll tighter, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. For her, cars like this did not stop in places like this unless they meant trouble. Her mother's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steadying her, signaling caution without a word. From the back seat, the billionaire watched them through tinted glass. He had never sought out streets like these, never slowed his life enough to see them, yet here he was, parked at the edge of a world foreign to him. The humiliation of the supermarket had not left him. It clung like smoke, seared into his skin, but above the shame rose a memory brighter than ridicule, the girl's trembling hand offering her only coins. That memory had pulled him here, into terrain where his name held no weight. The driver stepped out, opened the door, and the man emerged. The air seemed to shift, not with power this time, but with unease. He stood taller than most, his gray hair trimmed, his coat tailored with precision, but wealth could not soften the contrast. Here, buildings leaned tiredly against each other, paint peeled from walls, and the smell of frying oil mixed with damp concrete. His polished shoes touched ground that had not known polish in decades. The girl pressed closer to her mother, her shoulders stiff. She recognized authority in his posture, but not kindness. Her instinct was to pull away. Yet something in his eyes, hesitant, almost apologetic, stopped her from fleeing outright. He was not here to laugh at her or to push her aside like others had. He looked human in a way she could not fully explain. He approached slowly, aware of how out of place he was. The residents nearby peeked from windows, their eyes narrowing at the spectacle. A billionaire in their midst, seeking something he could not buy. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible at his sides, his voice low when he finally spoke. Not a demand. Not an order. A request to talk. The girl's mother answered first, her voice edged with suspicion. Life had taught her that nothing came free, especially from men who looked like him. But the girl tugged her sleeve, whispering something she could not ignore. Against her better judgment, she agreed to listen. They sat on a low step outside the building, the girl perched between them, doll resting in her lap. The billionaire began with hesitation, words heavy, each one measured. He admitted the truth, his humiliation, his shock, and the way her gesture had shaken something loose inside him. He confessed that, in her small act, he had seen more humanity than in all his years of luxury. The mother remained guarded, but the girl tilted her head, studying him with eyes too wise for her age. She saw a man carrying shame like she carried hunger, quietly, constantly. She did not trust him, not yet, but she recognized pain when she saw it. The conversation moved slowly, each sentence a test. He asked about their lives, their struggles, their hopes. They spoke little at first, but gradually pieces slipped through. The rooms that never felt permanent, the meals stretched thin, the dreams postponed for survival. He listened, truly listened, and in doing so felt his world fracture again. His empire, with all its towers and accounts, had blinded him to the raw edges of existence. Now, through their words, he saw what wealth could never buy: resilience, dignity, and love born from scarcity. But the collision of worlds did not pass unnoticed. Within days, whispers spread. Neighbors questioned his presence. Business associates called with veiled warnings. His family's voices grew sharp, asking if he had lost his mind. To them, this connection was madness. A billionaire entangled with strangers from the margins, risking his name and reputation for nothing but sentiment. Yet for him there was no turning back. The line had already been crossed the moment the girl held out her coins. He had seen too much to retreat into the comfort of glass towers. Their faces haunted him, not as burdens, but as mirrors of what he had lost in his climb to the top. The girl in turn began to feel a shift. She noticed the way he listened without interruption, the way his gaze did not drift past her but stayed. No one had looked at her that way before, as if her words mattered, as if her life was worth more than pity. It unsettled her, but it also stirred something fragile, the beginnings of trust. That night, as the man returned to his world of marble halls and echoing silence, the collision of their two worlds pressed hard against him. He knew the days ahead would demand choices, between reputation and redemption, between the empire he had built and the humanity he was rediscovering. And the girl, lying on her thin mattress, whispered to her doll about the strange man who looked powerful but seemed broken. She did not know what he wanted from them, but she knew one thing with certainty. The world had shifted the moment their paths crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first calls arrived before sunrise, slipping past the filters his assistant had set like water through a net. A partner's voice, cheerful at first, then carefully neutral as the purpose surfaced. A board member requesting a quick alignment on optics. A cousin, all concern and calculation, wanting to know if he was all right and who, precisely, those people were. Each message arrived dressed in politeness, but the seams strained. Underneath lay the same demand: return to the orbit that had always protected you. He did not answer. The phone vibrated against the nightstand until it turned to silence, then flared again. He watched it without moving, listening instead to the house. There was the breath of the heating system, the faint creak of old wood adjusting to cold, the hour marked by a clock he had stopped hearing years ago. The sounds felt unfamiliar, as if the house itself were waiting to see what kind of man would rise into its rooms this morning. He showered until the steam blurred the mirror, then wiped a circle clear and faced himself. The image that stared back did not belong to headlines. Eyes shadowed, mouth set in a line that had grown too used to giving orders and not enough to asking questions. He thought of the girl's coins, the way her hand had not flinched from his shame, and his reflection shifted in his own mind, from a figure of authority to one under scrutiny. Downstairs, breakfast waited because the house did not know how not to provide. He sat with the formality of a guest and sipped coffee that tasted, for once, like something other than routine. The quiet around him had the feel of a held breath. It reminded him of hospital corridors long ago, when the next sentence would define the rest of a life. Impulse urged him to flee into busyness, meetings, signatures, numbers, while something steadier kept him in his chair. Running had served him once. It would not serve now. By mid-morning the tidal pressure rose. His communications director, expert at the theater of damage control, requested talking points and an approved narrative. A summary of community engagement initiatives was proposed as a shield. A foundation photo op was suggested. 2 influencers could be brought in to humanize the moment. The language was efficient, bloodless, a toolkit designed to turn complication into content. He recognized its usefulness and understood its cost. The story would be laundered until it no longer told the truth. He closed the laptop without replying. Across town a mother folded a blanket with careful hands, and a girl placed a doll in a bag the way one tucks a secret where it cannot be broken. Their morning moved forward without a strategist. That knowledge steadied him more than any memo could. At the office the building's skin, a curtain of glass that reflected the city into anonymity, accepted him with the same indifference as always. In the elevator, the mirrored walls offered a chorus of him, none quite accurate. On the top floor, his reception area held the exact scent and temperature it held every day. The staff's faces, trained to remain neutral, broke into curious flickers that died as quickly as they appeared. The world had seen him kneel beneath a word on a screen. The footage had spread with the velocity of nastier weather. Now every greeting carried the slight strain of a held question. Was it true? Did it matter if it was? Meetings ran with the crisp choreography he had once found calming. Projections, risk models, legal exposure, investor morale, each topic slid forward on rails. Yet beneath the motion lay a vibration he could not ignore. In his mind the conference table kept shrinking until it was only a counter in a supermarket, a place where a child raised a trembling hand and reset his definitions. At lunch he agreed to a call with the partner who had phrased concern as loyalty since the first hours. The man's tone balanced on the knife edge between friendship and threat. There were responsibilities, he reminded gently. Boards do not like surprises. Markets prefer harmony. If the narrative continued to spiral, measures would need to be taken for the good of all. There was talk of committees, of independent review. Words designed to sound antiseptic while preparing the room for scalpels. He listened. He thanked him. He ended the call and let the silence reclaim its ground. A line from years ago returned, uninvited: values are what you keep when keeping them costs you. He had said it in a speech to graduates, believing it as a principle for other people. Now it circled back as an invoice with his name on it. By late afternoon the media had refined its appetite. Headlines settled on a single frame: the powerful brought low. The clip of the girl stepping forward ran as a curiosity at the end, a garnish for outrage. No one asked what a child had to sacrifice to carry coins like that. No one asked how a life becomes so resourceful that generosity survives hunger. He saw, with precision that felt like pain, how quickly a person becomes a device in someone else's story. That night he returned to the neighborhood where the buildings leaned into each other as if bracing against weather. The car idled again with patient respect. He did not send the driver to the door, did not summon anyone. He stepped onto the sidewalk and let the cold make its case. Windows flickered with lives perceived. The mother listened with the intelligence of someone who has balanced ledgers made of air. She asked questions not for drama but for survival. What did help me? For how long? At what price? He answered with structure where he could and with humility where he couldn't. No cameras. No announcements. Immediate needs first. Food, medicine, a door that locked. Choices would remain theirs. If they said no, he would not return. If they said yes, he would move carefully and keep faith with that care. The girl watched him as one watches a shoreline from a small boat. She did not smile. She did not shrink away. She tightened her grip on the doll once, then loosened it, and he felt, absurdly, as if the world had granted him a probationary reprieve. Word of his visit spread anyway. A neighbor asked for a job and was offended by a referral to an agency instead of a handout. A distant relative parked at the block's end and photographed his car, then sent the pictures to a gossip site with a caption that sounded like concern. His assistant texted from the office about an emergency board session. By the time he drove home, the night around the mansion had taken on the gaze of an audience. He walked through rooms that had once felt like proof of a life well executed. Their polish reflected him back as smaller than he had ever felt within them. The calls he had been avoiding condensed into a single unavoidable hour. He took them all. He let the lawyers talk. He let the family talk. He let the investors talk. He let the old friend who had become a metric talk until the man exhausted his own sentences. Then he said a sentence he had not known he would say until he heard himself saying it. I'm not negotiating her existence. The line surprised even him with its clarity. The calls ended quickly after that, the way storms sometimes do when they realize the ground will not yield. Sleep did not come. He moved through the house, turning off lights he had not noticed were on, opening a window to let in a cold that stung him awake. He stood at the glass and watched the dark hold shape without borders. Somewhere on the other side of the city a child slept with a doll tucked under her chin, and a mother lay awake calculating the price of saying yes to a stranger. He had never felt as rich as he did when he understood that his resources could be converted into safety rather than spectacle. He had never felt as exposed. Morning carried consequences. The board met without gentleness. There were motions and counter-motions. He observed, among people who believed themselves architects of futures, a fear of disorder that did not resemble care for human beings. He offered them numbers because numbers were the only language they respected. A separate fund, his own capital, indemnification for the company. He built a wall around his choice so their trembling would stop. The wall satisfied them enough to postpone revolt. It satisfied him enough to continue. After the meeting he walked past the photographs that lined the corridor, ribbons cut, hands shaken, trophies lifted, and recognized them as altars to a self that had forgotten why it started building. Grief had once taught him to survive by narrowing the world into tasks. The girl's gesture had taught him to widen it again, even if widening invited arrows. He returned to the neighborhood with a plan as pragmatic as it was simple. A small apartment could be secured within walking distance of the school the girl might attend if enrollment could be arranged mid-year. A stipend could be routed through a community organization to avoid dependency on his name. Medical and dental appointments could be booked without fanfare. Groceries could be delivered in ordinary bags without logos. He could be present without being the point. He presented the options on the same stoop, voice low, details precise, and then he did the most difficult thing. He stopped speaking. The mother weighed each offer as if turning a shard of glass in good light. She asked if she would owe him. He said she would not. She asked if he would expect access. He said no. She asked if he would leave if asked to leave. He said yes and felt the word bind him in a way contracts rarely did. For the first time, the girl's eyes left the doll and rested fully on his face. He felt the measure of the moment pass between them like a current. She nodded once, a movement so slight it could have been a shiver, and the air in his chest loosened. The first hours of practical help are not cinematic. They are lists and keys and signatures and the long, careful work of not breaking what you mean to mend. He stood back when pride stepped forward, stepped in when bureaucracy tried to humiliate, and learned, with surprising speed, when silence served better than solutions offered too quickly. The mother's shoulders dropped half an inch when the new door closed well on the first try. The girl walked a slow circle around a room with 2 windows and counted outlets as if they were stars. When the refrigerator hummed, he watched her lay a palm against it, testing the promise of steady cold. Pressure did not vanish, it repositioned. A headline speculated about motives with an elegant sneer. A donor threatened to withdraw unless he returned to form. An old rival sent a message congratulating him on discovering charity, which was cruelty disguised as camaraderie. He filed each barb into a drawer he would never open again. That night he found himself in the new apartment's kitchen, standing in the doorway while the mother rinsed cups and the girl drew shapes on a notepad the building manager had left. No one stage managed their gestures for him. No one recited gratitude. The ordinariness of it, water running, pencil on paper, the low hum of a heater doing its work, felt like a benediction. He drove home under a sky that refused to clear. The mansion received him with its usual theater of light, and he walked past it into the one room where he still kept the shades half drawn. He sat in the dark and let the day replay, not as a montage of accomplishments but as a map of chosen risks. The arithmetic had changed. The currency had changed. In a moment that began with humiliation, the storm around him did not pass, it shifted. Where humiliation had first mocked and then pressure had threatened, now came a quieter, steadier challenge, to live each day in the truth the girl had shown him. Wealth had once meant freedom to escape discomfort. Now it meant the duty to stay present in places where escape would have been easiest. He returned often, never with cameras, never with witnesses. He brought nothing more dramatic than groceries in plain bags, notebooks with clean pages, and the patient willingness to sit at a kitchen table too small for his long frame. At first the mother treated him like a man carrying hidden contracts. But the days arranged themselves into patterns, and patterns softened suspicion. She watched how he accepted tea poured into chipped cups without a wince, how he listened without steering the story, how he left when asked to leave. Slowly the wall between them grew porous. The girl still measured him with her silences, but silence itself changed. It no longer carried distrust, it carried testing. She would set the doll on the table, its painted eye fixed on him, and draw while he spoke with her mother. Sometimes she looked up as if to see if his attention stayed. It always did. He discovered that trust, like grief, does not arrive all at once but accumulates like drops of water, each one fragile, together unstoppable. Beyond their small apartment, his own world continued to wrestle with him. Journalists demanded statements. Investors asked for assurance. His family oscillated between scolding and pleading. Each encounter tempted him back into old reflexes, to shield, to control, to spin. Yet each time he considered yielding, he saw again the child pressing her meager coins toward him in a room full of ridicule, and he remembered that dignity had been restored to him not by power but by innocence. He could not betray that by returning to the theater of lies. He began diverting resources quietly. A scholarship fund under no one's name but the school's. A community clinic supplied anonymously. Rent paid for 3 families listed under a non-profit ledger. Each act was small compared to the empire he commanded, yet each one left a deeper mark on him than any skyscraper. His advisors complained that generosity without publicity was wasted. He told them, when pressed, that not everything valuable needed to be bought with recognition. Months passed, and the girl grew into her days with steadier ground beneath her feet. She studied with intensity that startled her teachers. She asked questions too sharp for her age. Her dream, once whispered to the doll alone, began to take shape in open air. She wanted to heal, to place her hands where hurt had settled, to be the kind of presence that changed endings into beginnings. Medicine was the word she learned to name it. The billionaire, though he had stopped thinking of himself in that title, watched her ambition grow with a kind of reverence. He realized that what she had given him in that supermarket was not merely kindness, it was a template. She had offered what little she had to restore a stranger's dignity. Now it was his turn to multiply that gesture, to spend not only his money but his life in service of restoring what the world had stolen from others. There were setbacks. The media grew tired of silence and invented noise. A rival staged a scandal that nearly toppled one of his ventures. Old habits whispered that retreat was safer, that generosity could wait until storms passed. But storms no longer frightened him. He had learned, from a child's hand and a chipped doll, that storms are not survived by hiding but by refusing to let fear dictate the next step. One evening, as sunset spilled copper light across the apartment walls, the girl presented him with a drawing. In shaky lines she had sketched a hospital with tall windows and a figure in a white coat beside a child smiling from a bed. She pointed at the coat and said softly, That will be me. For a moment words failed him. He saw not the drawing but the future it represented. A life devoted not to accumulation but to healing. His throat tightened, and he placed the drawing carefully in his jacket pocket, as if it were more precious than any contract he had ever signed. Redemption is not a single moment, it is a collection of choices made again and again. He learned this truth slowly but firmly. And with every visit, every meal shared, every laugh coaxed from the girl who once offered him her last coins, he felt the chains of arrogance and emptiness fall further away. When he finally walked home each night, his mansion no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a station, a place to gather strength for the next act of repair. And though the city still named him billionaire, though the market still judged him by numbers, he knew himself now by a different measure. The distance between who he had been and who that little girl had taught him to become. Years moved quietly, not as sudden transformations but as steady work, like water carving stone. The girl grew taller, her hair tamed into neat. He had built towers and watched them scrape the sky. He had signed contracts worth more than some nations. Yet nothing had filled him the way her victory did. It was not a reflection of his power, but of hers. A destiny she had shaped with determination, sparked by a gesture in a supermarket when the world had laughed. Years later, she walked through hospital halls in a white coat, her steps steady, her voice calm. Children clung to her hands the way she had once clung to her doll. Parents looked at her with the same desperate hope she had once carried in her chest. She healed not only with medicine but with presence, with the assurance that someone saw them, someone cared. The billionaire, older now, visited one evening. He stood at the edge of the ward, watching her bend over a patient's bed, her hair falling loose from its braid, her expression focused and kind. He realized then that his story had found its end not in his redemption, but in her beginning. She had taken the impossible and turned it into a lifetime of service. When she finally noticed him, she walked over and handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was the old drawing she had once made, a hospital, a figure in a white coat, a smiling child. She had signed her name beneath it with the steady script of someone who had become what she once only dreamed. For the first time in years he let himself cry. Not tears of shame, not of regret, but of release. He had been saved not by wealth, not by power, but by innocence that refused to let humiliation define the end of a story. And as he left the hospital that night, he understood with absolute clarity. The impossible is never measured in riches, but in the courage of a child who chooses to give when the world expects her to take.